In our last session, we looked at the theory that the rapture happens pre-tribulation. And we recognise that the basis of this belief is that the church is taken out of the tribulation, that the church avoids the tribulation and is raptured to be with Jesus before Israel then goes through the tribulation. And it's based on an understanding of a different view of Israel and the church, that they're two different entities. And that's the view of a pre-tribulation rapture. And when I look at the arguments for the pre-tribulation rapture, and then I look at the second theory, which is that the rapture happens midway through the tribulation, in other words, it's a mid-tribulation rapture, many of the arguments that are used for the pre-tribulation are also valid for the mid-tribulation. And so some of the scriptures that we looked at in our last session, you could look at again and apply equally to mid-tribulation as you could pre-tribulation. It's a question of perspective. And some of that perspective is then rooted on an understanding of where the wrath of God fits. So we recognised that last time a pre-tribulation view would probably lean to the wrath of God beginning when the four horsemen ride out, whereas a mid-tribulation view is working on the basis that the first part of a tribulation is where sin is allowed to run its course. The four horsemen of the apocalypse ride out, sin is allowed to run full course. And midway through the tribulation, when the beast comes up, we then see that after that, the plagues that come as a result are described as the wrath of God. So a mid-tribulation rapture view assumes that the wrath of God begins halfway through the tribulation. So let us explore the biblical basis for a mid-tribulation rapture. And to begin with, we start in Revelation 15, where we see the last 10 plagues that come through the tribulation as being described as the wrath of God. But because we see in 1 Thessalonians, Paul talking about the church avoiding the wrath of God, there's a belief that this is the point when the church is raptured. Verses that support this view and interpretations that support this view would begin in Matthew 24, when Jesus himself is talking, and when he talks about the people who are, one is in the field and one's left. The setting of that is after the apocalyptic signs. So it's coming towards the end of the tribulation. And in Revelation 14, verse 14, when we read of one coming on the clouds, what we read is that comes after the beast has been released. So halfway through the tribulation, we get this picture of one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds and reaping, swinging his sickle. And part of the evidence that we looked at for the rapture being a biblical view is rooted in Revelation 14, where Jesus is seen coming on the clouds. But that is the first reference through the tribulation to Jesus actually coming on the clouds. It's the first reference we get to when this Son of Man coming on the clouds appears. So even though John refers in Revelation 1 to the Son of Man coming on the clouds, we don't see that until we get halfway through the tribulation in Revelation 14. In 2 Thessalonians 1, there's reference to some of what we see happening at the end of the tribulation. And in Matthew 24, Jesus himself says that the time of the tribulation will be cut short for the sake of the elect. So if the rapture is the rapture of the elect, the rapture of the chosen ones, there is a view that this then is rooted midway through the tribulation. Some of the other biblical reasons why people believe in a mid-tribulation rapture is actually coming from some of the core writings that we've read. So 2 Thessalonians 2, when Paul's writing to the church in Thessalonica, he's saying to them, don't believe that some of the stories you've heard, don't be concerned that Jesus coming has already come and you've missed it, because before Jesus comes for his church, And before we get to some of the things that Paul describes, Paul's saying in 2 Thessalonians 2 that first there's going to be this great rebellion, followed by the man of lawlessness being revealed. And so the context Paul has for, you won't see Jesus return until these things happen, would put that return of Jesus towards, after we've seen some of the signs of a tribulation. Whereas some people argue that Revelation 4, where John is called up to heaven to get the vision of Revelation, is a prophetic picture of the church, there's actually no reference to the church in that passage. So some people discount that because the church is clearly referred to up to this point, but not when John is taken up to heaven. There's a sense of actually we need to see that literally rather than as a prophetic image. If we come back as well to Romans 11, where Paul's speaking about the church being engrafted branches and part of Israel, then this would imply that the church is part of the new people of God. And so is actually going through the tribulation until we get to the wrath, halfway through, and that's when Jesus is seen coming on the clouds in Revelation 14 and taking his church to be with him, swinging the sickle, harvesting his church. Much of the belief in a mid-tribulation rapture is rooted in things like Romans 5 verse 9 that looks at Christians being spared the wrath of God. And we see the last 10 plagues from Revelation 15 being described as the wrath of God. And we see Jesus coming on the clouds just before this. But actually we also don't see any sense in Matthew 24 of the church being spared the suffering of a tribulation. Jesus is teaching in Matthew 24, if that's only for the elect, if that's only for Israel, then actually it's inconsistent with the rest of the Gospels which relate to all people. If Jesus is talking to his disciples and saying that this only applies to the people of Israel, then that's not in keeping with everything else that Jesus has said. That's another argument that people put forward for the reason why the church is present during the tribulation. Daniel and Revelation both have a distinct break halfway through. And when we look at this view, we see in Revelation 14 a clear picture that this is the point in the account of end times where we see Jesus coming on the clouds. And in verses 14 to 16, we see him coming for those who are saved. And in Revelation 17, then we see him dealing with those who aren't saved. This view may be one which you might have some questions about. That's okay. I would encourage you to ask yourself those questions and actually test the things that you read in the Bible and form your own view of where do you think the rapture fits with what the Bible has to say.